What's up, everybody? Legendary Academy Award-winning director Oliver Stone is back with Nuclear Now, his first film in 7 years, coming exclusively to theaters across the USA and Canada beginning on April 28th. That's the end of this week. Based on the book A Bright Future, written by award-winning scholar of international relations, Professor Joshua S. Goldstein, who also co-wrote the film, Nuclear Now explores the possibility for the global community to overcome the challenges of climate change and energy poverty to reach a brighter future through the power of nuclear energy, an option that may become the only viable way to ensure our continued survival sooner than we think. With unprecedented access to the nuclear industry in France, Russia, and the United States, director Oliver Stone delivers a revolutionary documentary that Variety has called an intensely compelling must-see film. It opens in New York and Los Angeles on the 28th, April 28th, a few days from now, put it in your calendars, with special one-day screening events across North America on Nuclear Now Day, which is May 1st. You won't want to miss that. By the way, I will be at the Chicago one on May 1st at the Alamo Drafthouse in Wrigleyville. So if you want to learn more about that or meet me there, go to the Alamo Drafthouse's website and check out nuclearnowfilm.com to learn more about this. And with that, on with the show. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, your Nuclear Barbarian, Emmett Penny, and I am here with returning guest Noah Rettberg, and we are back on our Synthfuels grind, my man. How are you doing, buddy?
Great.
Good. Me too.
I did find something funny to say here.
No, that's all right. So for those who are new to the show, you can go back through on the Substack archives or wherever you listen to this and find our earlier episodes on Synthfuels. We've done a whole bunch of stuff. But one of the things we haven't done is sourcing fuel from carbon, which is important. But before we get to that, I probably need to ask Noah some more big dumb questions that I'm becoming famous for. And the first one is this, buddy, why do we want that? Why do we want fuels from carbon?
Okay, so basically all the fuels that we are currently using are carbon-based fuels, whether they are biofuels, which don't have that high of a market share, or fossil fuels, they are carbon-based fuels. Oil is hydrocarbon, and gas is hydrocarbons, and coal is hydrocarbon leaning heavily on the carbon side. So all the fuels we are currently using are hydrocarbon, but that shouldn't just be a reason to just keep using hydrocarbon. So if we are trying to transition away from fossil fuels, which are all hydrocarbons, one could consider, why don't we just transition to a non-carbon based fuel? Because if we don't burn a non-carbon-based fuel, there isn't any CO2 in the exhaust to begin with. If we don't, and if we if we modify our technology in a way that runs on non-carbon-based fuels, it can't be used for carbon-based fuels. So this is also something that many green people would prefer, as they are fearful that continuing to use combustion technology with the premise of using non-carbon-based fuels with the premise of using synthetic fuels might lock us in a scenario where we are continuing to burn fossil fuels in the future. So there are some people that would prefer for us to burn non-carbon-based fuels. And theoretically, if you're crazy, you could make fuels from everything. And if you
Hypothesis: if you lose your mind first.
so some people, people that lose their mind
Yeah.
with alarming frequency are people that are, like me, into space exploration. And people have put forward the craziest ideas for rocket fuels.
Yeah.
Burning fluorine, burning chlorine, and rocket fuels to meet some niche performance criteria or storability criteria are some of the craziest and most dangerous fuels you can ever imagine. So
let me ask before you go on. My guess is that when it comes to rocket fuels, there's also like a weight issue that you need to consider, right?
yes,
Or no?
yes. So the efficiency of rocket fuels is basically measured in the exhaust velocity of the exhaust gases from the rocket engine, and you want this to be the highest you can get it. Because if it gets low, the fuel requirements grow exponentially. And if you want to leave Earth with a very big gravitational field, then you need to go very fast, and you already have thin margins to leave Earth. So you want very fuel efficient rockets, which means you need fuel with high exhaust velocity. Fuels with high exhaust velocity are hydrogen and methane, and kerosene is decent, but there are also other requirements because early rocket engines were shit to ignite, and also storability was an issue. If you have a rocket that flies out into space, where one side of the rocket gets plus 200 degrees Celsius, the other gets minus 100 degrees Celsius from being in the sun or being in the sun's shadow, then boil off is an issue, storability is an issue. So rockets have used fuels that you would see nowhere else. And rockets are a scenario where, for example, nitrogen-based fuels were used, hydrazine, especially unsymmetric dimethyl hydrazine was used for rocket engines to be able to be stored for a long time and to be able to make reliable rocket engines with the primitive technology of the 60s. But dimethyl hydrazine is toxic, hydrazine is toxic, and these rocket fuels were really nasty. And when we talk about why we, for example, would not want to use nitrogen-based fuels, the toxicity issue is one issue that greatly enforces this. And this is mainly the reason why space exploration currently wants to go back from using hydrazine as a fuel. So this is very interesting. The only industry in the world where non-hydrocarbon-based fuels were popular is currently shifting away from non-hydrocarbon-based fuels towards hydrocarbon-based fuels. And I think this should give us some really good insights into why hydrocarbon-based fuels are so great. Is because they are relatively benign, relatively low in toxicity, they are stable to store, and easy to handle and easy to make. So this is the main reason why the space industry moves away from synthetic fuels. But when we talk about synthetic fuels that are non-carbon based, you have three candidates. You have plain hydrogen, you have nitrogen-based fuels, and you have silicon-based fuels. Silicon is a chemical compound very similar to carbon. It also has it can form 4 atomic bonds. It can easily form bonds with itself, so you can very easily replicate what carbon is doing with silicon. But the problem is silicon. The combustion product of burning those silicon-based fuels is a solid, unlike at normal atmospheric conditions that we find ourselves in. So you would have to disperse not with a gas that your car or your boiler can easily exhaust, but you have to disperse with a fine ash which accumulates in large amounts when you burn the fuel. So this makes designing silicon-based fuels this makes designing appliances running silicon-based fuels very hard. And for the nitrogen, the problem is that the nitrogen does not want to form bonds with itself. So ammonia is very stable. It just has one nitrogen atom. But when you go into the longer chained nitrogen compounds, they all want to break apart. And this is why hydrazine is so nice for making rocket engine, because you can make monoprop. You just have the hydrazine breaking apart, reacting with itself. But this is very undesirable for our earthly appliances. And also another negative part of the nitrogen is it only has 3 of these atomic bonds. So ammonia is like comparable to methane. Both have only one nitrogen or carbon atom and then some hydrogen stuck to it. Ammonia has 3 hydrogen atoms and carbon has 4. And when you make the longer chains, you have even, because then always the nitrogen has 2 of its arms connected to another nitrogen. It has only nitrogen on one of its arm. So it gets really inefficient at storing hydrogen. And nitrogen in itself doesn't store energy. When we burn carbon, the carbon reacting with the oxygen releases energy. If we burn nitrogen with oxygen, this eats energy. It's an endothermic reaction. So we actually don't want for our nitrogen to burn, because then we lose energy that we put into the fuel, and we also produce highly toxic nitrous oxide. So while there are certainly fans of nitrogen or silicon-based fuels, and there are a crap ton of fans right now, including in established institutions that want to see us utilizing hydrogen as a fuel, which I think we already talked about why using hydrogen as a fuel is not that great. So these fuels are really undesirable, and we want to keep using carbon-based fuels in the future.
Right. Okay. So that was a really great summary. So there are a lot of advantages to using carbon-based stuff. We've got low toxicity, we've got portability, we've got all of these other factors for it. And unlike something like hydrogen, they don't tend to fragilize the thing that's storing them. That's really important. So let's talk about sourcing now. What's the most important part of this?
I think the most important part is assessing where we are now. We have, because what we are currently doing, we have a large stockpile of carbon and already carbon-based fuels, which we can utilize from the ground. And we are running this basically open cycle. We are putting carbon from our stockpile into the atmosphere until the atmosphere is full of carbon and we don't have any stockpiles anymore. And this isn't a really sustainable way of sourcing fuels. So what we would need to do is get away from this unsustainable way of sourcing fuel and sourcing carbon from fossil fuels. And there are limited ways in which we can source carbon sustainably. Something that is often brought up is the possibility of sourcing carbon, sometimes just for the sake of lowering CO2 concentration, sometimes to make synthetic fuels from the smokestacks of coal power plants or from cement factories. But the issue here is you need to rely, because this is a way of basically greenhouse gas neutral sourcing carbon for your fuels, but you rely on these other industries to basically never become greenhouse gas neutral. If I capture the CO2 from a coal plant, make fuel from it, and then burn my fuel, in the end, global humanity is still increasing CO2 level in the atmosphere, and we are decreasing our stockpile of carbon. You can then do accounting, because we have because there is a caption process in between the coal plant and the atmosphere, whether you count all that CO2 to my fuel that I'm burning or to the coal plant from which I captured the carbon. But in the end, you can say that my fuel is greenhouse gas neutral, but the coal plant then isn't. But in the end, what this means is I can only source greenhouse gas neutral fuels as long as other industries are not greenhouse gas neutral.
Continue pumping them out. Okay, I got you. I got you. Interesting. So what's the next step here? Like, what's the next thing we need to think about?
So what we will need is a way of sourcing carbon that does not negatively affect other industry sectors becoming greenhouse gas neutral, and that does not affect other us stopping to reducing our stockpile of hydrocarbons.
That sounds tricky.
Yes. One way that this sourcing carbon from smokestacks is often spoken about is the cement industry. Because when we made cement or when we roast iron ore, we are breaking down carbonate salts into into metals and into CO2. And these carbonate salts, when we break them down, either from cement production or iron production, this releases CO2 into the atmosphere, which is not fossil-based, but it's still increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. It still has the previous problem. However, while there is cement, there also is lime mortar. Lime mortar is basically the mortar that predates modern cement. Most historic buildings were built with a lime mortar. It's only the Romans for a short period of time, and then people nowadays that have been using cement, which releases CO2 during production, but does not capture it when it hardens. But lime mortar basically lime mortar is calcium carbonate, and that turns into calcium oxide when you burn it. And then when you mix it with water and sand to have the mortar for your building, then it hardens out, and it can only harden when it has access to the air and then draws carbon dioxide from the air back into itself to form calcium carbonate, which then binds your building together. Lime mortar, the use of lime mortar for buildings has decreased due to the upcoming of cement, but lime mortar is still used in many applications in construction nowadays, and even factory pre-built modules for modern building are often made with lime mortar in factories to make housing. So the lime mortar industry, unlike the cement industry, is something where you could source carbon from sustainably forever. But the problem is the lime mortar industry is small. And even if we drastically increase the use of lime mortar, will forever stay significantly smaller than what we need in carbon for our fuel needs.
Gotcha.
And this is an issue because sustainability and scalability are two different things. Many things are sustainability is at low scale, and sourcing CO2 from lime mortar is certainly sustainable, but it isn't scalable. We hit limits in how much fuel we can make from that very early on.
Okay. So it sounds like we have a big task ahead of us, is what you're telling me.
Yes, we need to find carbon sources which are both sustainable and scalable.
So do we have any candidates for that in your mind?
So when we have excluded the capturing of CO2 from smokestack because it's scalable but certainly not sustainable. And we have excluded the lime mortar because yes, it is sustainable but not scalable. The next thing that is often talked about is using biogenic carbon. And now we are coming to something which is much more scalable and has questionable sustainability. When we are, as we are, in the sphere of people that like nuclear energy, there is something that most nuclear people really dislike, and it's bioenergy. So wood burning, biofuels, this is something that many nude bros rightfully are against because the way we are currently doing it is very much non-sustainable. We're chopping down forests without replenishing those forests in adequate numbers to burn them in power plants. We are growing food, growing starches and oils to make biogenic ethanol and biofuels to burn in cars and trucks. So this in an era where food production in itself is something that we have to make greenhouse gas emissions neutral, has sustainability problems, sourcing biofuels. But when we made biofuels, in general, what people want to make with biofuels is energy. It's bioenergy, not biogenic carbon. Of course, if I capture some biogenic carbon from wood, there's always some energy that comes with that wood. But if you look at how much energy per amount of carbon certain fuels have, you see that, for example, wood has drastically less energy, 3 to 4 times less energy per amount of carbon, which is why so many people rail against wood burning. Because if you just look at tailpipe emissions, wood burning has drastically more CO2 emissions than coal, and drastically more than petrol or gas has. So, and this goes for all biomass except for like fats. Fats have a higher energy per amount of carbon, which is the reason why our body stores energy in fat and not in carbohydrates or proteins. But in generally biomass has a very little energy per amount of carbon involved. And the fuels that we need to have a lot of energy per amount of carbon involved. So when we make biofuels, we need to go through purification processes. For example, when we turn starch into alcohol, into ethanol, basically making a kilogram of sugar, turning it into ethanol, gives you half a kilogram of ethanol. But the half a kilogram of ethanol contains almost all the energy that the kilogram of sugar had. So the fermentation process concentrates the energy, but it also loses some of it. And to then ferment the sugar and then distill it into pure ethanol, these are all energy-intensive processes. So these make biofuels so undesirable because we can't harness a lot of the energy in the bioenergy. But if what we are looking for is not energy from our biomass, but just the carbon, and we assume that we have a sustainable and clean energy source that is also cheap, nuclear, at our disposal, then we don't need to worry whether there is a lot of energy in our carbon source or not, or whether we have to purify it, because we are only looking at the biomass for a source of carbon. And this drastically increases the amount of biomass that we can source. For example, if you want to make biodiesel, then you put a huge field of canola, and from that field you gain like several kilogram of red biomass per square meter. But from those several kilogram of biomass, what you get in the end is like 100 milliliters, like a tiny amount that can fit into a shot glass of actual oil. So most of the biomass that gets produced by the plants that made the oil for biodiesel doesn't end up in the oil. We have ways utilizing it. Some of the compounds get utilized as fodder for animals, but others can't. Just like when we grow wheat, we can utilize, or corn, we can utilize the starches for food or for ethanol making. But most of the mass of the plant doesn't exist inside the starch, but exists in other biomass. And there have been several failed attempts at fermenting the other biomass into ethanol, into fuel. But we don't need to rely on these processes, these fermentation processes, because we have so much energy at our disposal from our beautiful nuclear power plants, which we can turn into process heat and which we can turn into hydrogen to then use this biomass not as an energy source, but as a carbon source to make drastically larger amounts of of fuels than we could make if we would use the biomass for biofuels.
Okay, so it's sort of like let me see if I can understand this a little bit, because there's a lot going on here. So the way we use biofuels now feels a lot like stepping down the energy ladder rather than moving
Yes,
up
very
it,
much.
right? And so that's sort of the problem we have with it now. But if we could integrate a low carbon, low emissions energy source that's very abundant into the processing elements, right? Sort of the first stage elements to making this stuff, then it would actually not move us down the energy ladder. What we're really getting is more options and more abilities to implement biofuels and create them.
Yes, certainly. It's I don't I don't like to use the word biofuel for this because it's such a loaded term.
Okay, sure, yeah.
I
meant it neutrally, but like,
I speak
yeah.
of biogenically sourced synthetic fuels because they are drastically different from like biofuels like bioethanol or biodiesel.
Okay.
But yes, this is the thing. We can essentially get like an order of magnitude more fuel than we would get if we would use traditional biofuels, because we can use a much broader array of biomass, and we basically are stepping up the energy ladder from the energy that we get from our nuclear plants, or renewables, if you believe in that, to make a to make a lot more fuel than we could if we would just rely on bioenergy. So this drastically changes the equation, but it still limits us because plants are not efficient neither at capturing carbon nor at capturing energy. So even if we drastically change the amount of carbon that we can use in our fuel and drastically store more energy to that fuel, we can't use hydrocarbons in the way that we are currently using. One could argue that we are using hydrocarbons currently for more processes than we actually need, because in the future, when you have plentiful nuclear energy, you could, of course, use grid electricity or nuclear heat for many of the processes for which we are currently burning hydrocarbons. So applications for hydrocarbons in the future, outside of the chemical industry, some lubrication, and some it's just chemical industry, some lubrication, some vehicles, planes, and rocketry. So the sectors where we definitely need to have synthetic fuels as our energy vector and can't utilize grid electricity or can't utilize nuclear heat directly from our plants, those sectors are not as big as all the sectors that are currently mostly relying on hydrocarbon fuels for the energy. Home heating, process heat, metallurgy does not necessarily need to rely on fuels for their energy, but could use grid electricity. So if we basically tighten our belts and only use synthetic fuels for processes that really need them, like 50% of all cars, 80% of all trucks, planes, rockets, and some ships, and some lubricants, then it is possible to make enough biogenic synthetic fuels in a sustainable way for us to decarbonize our society. But we might desire to drastically grow our energy use and to drastically grow our consumption of hydrocarbon fuels. For example, I talked about rocketry. Rocketry is something that devours large amounts of hydrocarbon fuels, but really opens us to new possibilities. If we would want, like I do, desire to
Mm-hmm.
see more people in the future gain access to space outside of Earth,
Mm-hmm.
then if we were to do that in a world where we could only source fuels from biogenic synthfuels, this would limit access to outer space to few people. Certainly more than we're currently having, but
But few
a
nonetheless.
future where like more people have access to space exploration, more people have access to air travel, more people have access to personal vehicles, where we can have more trucks and more ships, so that the rest of the world gets prosperous. That future, in a future where we only have biogenic synthfuels, that has some issues with scalability.
Mm. Okay, so the biogenic stuff will be useful for more boutique things, is what I'm hearing, right? If we're gonna have perhaps this would be cool in the future, mass space travel. That's not how we're going to be doing it.
I did a calculation once for like Germany,
Mm-hmm.
um, looking at how much biogenic waste we are having in Germany, how much wood burning that if decreased and then reallocated from home wood burning and power plant wood burning to synthetic fuel productions, how much fuels could we made in Germany in a sustainable way, not from biofuels, but from biogenically sourced synthfuels. And in a way that is sustainable, Germany could probably synthesize around 600 terawatt hours of hydrocarbon fuels from leftover biomass and from nuclear energy. However, Germany is currently burning over 3,000 terawatt hours of fossil fuels per year. So this would need to drastically decrease our use of hydrocarbon fuels in order to meet this demand from synthetic fuels. So home heating, process heat for industry, and some vehicles in this scenario could not be able to be run with hydrocarbon fuels anymore. But a large amount of vehicles and planes and ships and for example also emergency power supply for like the diesel generators at nuclear power plants, at all power plants, at hospitals. Also maybe some peaking, like in the extreme winter cold. These are applications for synthetic fuels, but we would not half. We could only use a fifth of the hydrocarbon fuels that we are currently using in Germany if we were to rely on nuclear and biomass-based synthetic fuels in the future that is sustainably.
Gotcha. Okay. So what else are we missing here?
The unpopular option.
All right, let's get into it. Let's get unpopular.
I'm not sure.
You've had a sip of your Monster. By the way, Monster Energy, Noah and I both love you. If you would like to sponsor this podcast, I will happily run ads. Love you, Monster. Okay. Noah, be unpopular for me.
I'm not sure it's unpopular, but it's controversial, and it's especially controversial inside our sphere of otherwise hardcore energy realists, and that is direct air capture of carbon dioxide.
Okay. Talk to me about it.
So
what's the controversy?
There is carbon dioxide in the air.
Yeah.
And if there is something in something, then there is the possibility of extracting that something out of that other something and utilizing it. The issue is that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air, while it's high enough to cause global warming, is really low compared to concentrations that we usually extract out of something. So the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air is currently like, I think, somewhere between 400 and 450 parts per million. So that is rather low. So we're speaking of 0.04% of the concentration of carbon dioxide here in the air. So and this is usually just the only thing that people critical of direct air capture put forward. So they just say, oh, it's low concentration in the air, That's all you need to know. That is because that is because it's not possible. So do something more serious.
Mm. So what's the response to that?
I would respond to the following.
Okay.
The average uranium mine has an ore concentration of 0.15%. That's not the enrichment of how much U35 to U38 is in there. This is just the amount of uranium metal per ton of ore extracted. There is in Namibia a mine called the Rössing mine, which is one of the largest uranium mines on Earth. And the Rössing mine has an ore concentration of just 0.04% uranium per ore.
Okay.
And in the ocean, we have a uranium concentration of not 9 parts per million, but 9 parts per billion uranium in the seawater. So if extracting uranium at a concentration similar to carbon in the air is viable, and extracting uranium at a concentration 5 orders of magnitude lower in the ocean might become viable in the future, in the not too distant future, then why do people think that extracting carbon dioxide at a concentration of 400 parts per million is impossible? So I think this would require us to talk about how high can any concentration be in order to make extraction viable. And if we want to discuss this, we need to look at several factors. First is, how hard is it to source what we are extracting from? Of course, uranium ore from the Rössing mine is much harder to source than air or water from the sea or the atmosphere. Another thing is the extraction process itself. Is this a very tedious, energy-intensive process to extract? And then there is the issue, what do you do with the tails? So you need to dispose of the uranium ore properly. In the past, we did not always do that, which has led to a few scandals, which still haunt the nuclear industry, even though that they are really long in the past. So these are issues that we need to take care of. Also, another issue is, how much is what we are extracting worth to us? Because uranium is much more worth to us than carbon. Of course, we can extract a lot more from it, and that is the reason why people go to the most extreme length to extract gold from ore, because it's of so high worth to us. And then you go to less precious metals like steel or copper, where you need to have also decent concentrations in the ore. But in our quest to fuel our ever-growing desire of copper, we are also going to ores with ever lower and lower concentrations to meet our demand for copper. So just saying it has low concentration doesn't mean it is necessarily not viable. What we need to look at is, how hard is it to source it, how hard is it to process, and what kind of baggage, what tails, what toxic byproducts do we leave in the sourcing and in the extraction process.
Okay, so how hard would it be to extract it comparatively?
So there are 2 viable processes from extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. One is basically running the carbon dioxide through an alkaline solution. I don't know if you did that in chemistry, but usually something that a chemistry teacher shows his students is the reaction of carbon dioxide in a water solution containing calcium oxide. So when you then the calcium oxide is highly water soluble, and when you then pour the carbon dioxide, blow the carbon dioxide gas into the water, you see certain amounts of bubbles rising through the liquid. But what you also see is a solid falling out of the solution. And the solid that falls out of the solution is the carbon dioxide that is blown through the water, reacting with the calcium oxide in the water, and then falling out to form calcium carbonate. So in this very simple setup, you of course capture the carbon from the capture the carbon dioxide from the gas that's blowing through the water, and you could build machines that do exactly this, that use alkaline compounds, alkaline oxides that are dissolved in water, and then blow air through them, and then let the carbonate salts that form settle, and then crack those open to reform carbon dioxide in the alkaline solution again. There was one project that aimed to utilize this at even a really large scale back in the 2000s, when America was in its nuclear renaissance, or its first nuclear renaissance, which sadly didn't amount to a lot. There were proposals to use the cooling towers of an AP1000 reactor for this. So in the cooling towers, you have what the cooling tower does. It pumps large amount of water that rains down, and then blows large amounts of air through this to cool the water down, and then recycle the water to cool the turbine. And in a cooling tower, you could not just do this with just lake water or river water. You could do this with alkaline solutions. So there were these proposals to basically build an AP1000, give it cooling towers, special build for this purpose, rather than running just plain water through them, run alkaline water through them, collect the carbonate salts that form at the bottom of the cooling towers, put them through an electrolyzer to separate the carbon and the alkaline metals once again, and then put the alkaline solution back into your cooling tower and have the carbon dioxide extracted from this process. So utilizing nuclear power plant cooling tower for this was something that was seriously considered. But the thing is, the nuclear renaissance didn't amount to a lot.
Tragically.
So if all we got out of it is two AP1000s to begin with, they got the rather vanilla cooling towers and didn't get the experimental cooling towers, which hopefully would extract some carbon dioxide from the air.
Gotcha.
And I think until we will see really large scale nuclear build-outs again, people won't consider this again, because it isn't something that you just do at a small scale, and it isn't something that you will do for non-nuclear power plants. Because
it's go big or go home.
If you do it for coal, and it's pointless if you just do it in a small scale. So I don't think we will see this way of capturing carbon dioxide from the air rather soon.
Okay. So yeah, basically what I'm hearing for you is like the major, as far as extraction goes, the major hurdles are like scale is the biggest one.
Yes, scale is basically the biggest one, because there is another way of capturing capturing CO2 from the air, which does work at a small scale, but does not work economically at a small scale. And that is another way is using an organic amino compound filtrate material to capture the CO2 from the air. So what you have in this thing is basically you have like a certain type of plastic, and this type of plastic has of course modified to have like really huge surface, and that air can pass through it, and you have, imagine like a catalytic converter, and you can have the possibility of air passing through it, and you then have a large surface, and on that plastic compound you have amino groups onto which the carbon dioxide can react and then bind to. This basically has a few benefits. First, your filtrate material is a solid, like a solid permeable sponge where you can push the air through, not just a big pile of water that you have to recirculate in a giant cooling tower. So you can have it have a block of it and then force air through it. And as the air enriches this compound with carbon dioxide, it gets trapped in there. And then you can run the reverse reaction. So we have a reaction where carbon dioxide from the air catches onto this material. Then you can have a reverse reaction where the carbon dioxide gets released. So this reaction is exothermic when it's captured. So the carbon dioxide reacts with amino group, gets captured, releases a little bit of heat in the process. And when you want to run the reverse reaction, you of course need to supply it with excess heat, and then you can release the carbon dioxide again and trap it. And the way this is utilized is basically you have this huge plastic sponge which can capture CO2 in a box. You have a fan on one side and an exit on the other side, and the fan continuously blows air through this sponge material. At a certain point, of course, the sponge is saturated. I'm calling it a sponge to kind of describe it. It's not called a sponge.
No, yeah. It doesn't look like SpongeBob SquarePants in there. Yeah, I got it.
I mean, it's kind of square. And then you can close the box. And when you can close the box, you can pump the air out of it and then heat the box up to run the reverse reaction. And then the CO2 gets released. And because the box was previously evacuated, what gas gets released in the process is almost pure carbon dioxide.
Gotcha.
And this is a process which is currently done at a very small scale in Hellisheidi in Iceland, where they have a small plant powered with geothermal energy, which is clean and sustainable.
Yeah.
But this plant only captures 4,000 tons of CO2 per year, which is pretty astonishing for a demonstration project, but still several orders of magnitude away from where we would want it to be. And they are currently working or building a significantly larger plant, basically 10 times of what the currently existing plant at Hellisheidi is. They are still building in Iceland. To my knowledge, that plant is supposed to get operational in 2024, so in roughly a year. And this plant is then supposed to suck out 40,000 tons of CO2 out of the air per year. And what we would need to see from this is not just that you can scale it up, because what we can see from it currently is that you can do it with an amount of energy that is acceptable. And what we would need to see is that you can scale it up and that you can decrease the cost of the project in the process. Currently, it costs like around 600 euros to extract a ton of CO2 from the air, which is significantly, it's more expensive than we would need it to be. But it's like already in the right order of magnitude from where we want it to be at around 100 to 200 euros per ton. So if you look at like the first nuclear plants and the first solar plants making 1,000 euros per megawatt hour in current days money for their electricity, and now they are at 20. So what one could hope for, but not guarantee until it's happened, is that cost will drop significantly as we grow from 4,000 to 40,000 to 400,000 to 4 million to 40 million tons of CO2. That in the process of industrializing this, that we can decrease the cost, because energy-wise, it's already good. You need 600 kilowatt hours of electricity to basically run the fans, which is requires the most heat, and you need around 2,000 kilowatt hours of low-grade heat to run the process of capturing a ton of CO2. So we are basically below in energy than gets released in the burning of hydrocarbons from the fuels that we would hopefully synthesize from this. So energy-wise, this process is already decent. Cost-wise, it currently isn't.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's the mode around that. All right. So let's start wrapping this up because I'm eating up a lot of your time today with this. I want to know, like, what you do some forecasting for me. Where do you see us going on this trajectory? What do you hope for?
I would hope that when we discuss this, we would try to get serious. First thing about the hydrogen question that we had in the last episode, and then about the carbon question. Currently, this isn't that big of an issue because when you're only talking about like prototype plans of synfuel production, you can source carbon from all sorts of ways. From fossil fuels, from coal, for example, you can source it from smokestacks, from cement production, from biomass. So if you talk about just establishing like small plants, made small batches of synthetic fuels to demonstrate that you can, people don't worry about sourcing carbon. When you talk about people that try to start up businesses making synfuels, they don't worry about carbon. They worry about the hydrogen because, well, we haven't figured that out yet. Renewables suck at making hydrogen. We don't have a lot of spare nuclear to source hydrogen, so they worry about the hydrogen much more than they worry about the carbon. But we need to talk about the carbon issue. If we want to make synthetic fuels, we need to make synthetic fuels, even if we see large-scale adoptions of battery electric vehicles in the future. So what I would hope to see us in the future is prioritize our use of biomass in ways that are more sustainable. We currently produce a crap ton of bioethanol and biofuels in a manner that isn't sustainable, and we could produce significantly larger amounts of food and also waste biomass for the production of synthetic fuels if we would stop the utilization of just plain bioenergy, not biogenic synthetic fuels, for either power plants or for bioethanol and biodiesel production. So I hope this is something where we would be going. Also, going to discussing how do we source, for example, wood. When it's talked like when the topic of wood for energy is brought up, we usually pretend like it's something that is just exploitative in the way that we source it. That we just cut down trees and then trees are gone and the amount of biomass in our nature decreases and the amount of carbon dioxide in the air decreases. If this were the case, then just hundreds of thousands of years of primitive energy use from wood would have already killed all life on Earth. So at low rates of extracting wood from forests, of course the forest will grow back fast enough.
Sure.
But this isn't economical. Economical extraction of wood means you cut down hectares of forest at the time, leave nothing behind, and then don't worry about what grows back. So us getting to a more sustainable sourcing of wood, both for construction material and for energy, would be something that I would like to see in the future. Generally, more sustainable forest management. I've seen unsustainable and sustainable forest management both here at home, and this is something that we need to see. Something that I would like to see is to use coppicing or pollarding once again. Basically, what you do there is you don't with certain tree species, when you cut them at certain times in the year at a certain height above the roots, what they do is the tree doesn't die out. It rather rapidly grows back. So what you can do with this is essentially grow a type of forest where rather than killing trees, you're giving them a haircut. This has been really popular in Germany, in England, in the pre-industrial times before we had coal, because this way you can source large amounts of firewood from a forest without destroying the forest and the negative influences that would come from just cutting down the forest and the flooding that would ensue. What would be nice is to see a way to do this in an industrialized manner, because in the past they just walked up to the tree, cut down the branches,
Right,
and then let it grow back.
Sure.
But I don't think we have, I don't think it, I know that we don't have that much of human labor to spare to source that small amounts of carbon. So we would need to have like industrialized way of doing tropists, and pollarding is a similar way of sourcing wood in the future, which would be a great benefit for biodiversity and the amount of sustainable wood that we can source. And what I would like to see is, of course, progress in the field of direct air capture. I think all of the people that are currently listening to this podcast are rather fond of nuclear energy and would, of course, like to see large amounts of AP1000s and EPRs and APR 1400s grow all over the world. And what would be nice to once consider again is whether it is possible to extract carbon dioxide from the cooling towers again. It might not be. Rather, sadly, the project in the 2000s didn't amount to much, and maybe it's we find out that it isn't worth the extra effort.
It's not viable.
But I would like to see not just us build a lot of nuclear power plants, but also once again look into it whether that is possible. Something that is currently happening, whether we build nuclear or we don't, is the sponge thing that they're doing in Iceland at the Helles Heidi plant. And I am certainly excited to find out about what we will hear from that. They have one plant already running, the small plant. They're building a significantly larger plant, and I'm interested in what will happen from this, what will come from this larger plant, and what will come after this larger plant. So Iceland has a lot of heat and electricity that it sources clean and sustainably from geothermal energy. So growing this industry in Iceland is basically growing this in the right place where we can already do this, unlike in Germany or the US, where we sadly don't have that much clean energy right now. So I'm very interested, and I'm following what they are doing. I've contacted those people, basically getting as a result. Let's see what we did. They are themselves cautious, I think, about this process because it is a controversial process, and there are a lot of people critical on that. And if I were them, I wouldn't overhype this too much. And I find it interesting that even then, when talking with someone that wasn't that critical, they were still like, okay, let's see what will come out of this plant that we are currently building and operating, and then we can give you some more constructive numbers in the future when we have the past experience behind us. So yeah, I'm excited to see what will come out of there. Hopeful that it will end well, and concerned that it might not.
Okay.
But I think one thing that I can say for certain about the direct air capture thing is it won't be decentralized, because I've already seen like some of the worst mixture of renewables and techno-optimists you see on Twitter hyping this as something that like everyone can have at their house with their solar panels.
Sure, yeah, I've seen that too.
You won't, for two reasons. A, this thing needs a lot of low-grade heat that you get easily from nuclear, including waste heat potentially, or from geothermal. And if you were to use solar from this, you would basically need to waste a lot of electricity on the otherwise easily procurable heat. And B, these plants, these things are expensive. They get more expensive the less of them to build. It's like a modular system because the boxes themselves are not that giant. But just putting one simple box on this is not as economical as putting thousands or hundreds of thousands of these boxes in a purposefully structured and layout plant. Just
Right.
like just mounting a single solar panel on your roof isn't efficient, but when you mount like gigawatts of solar panels in a large field, it's still not efficient, but it's like more economical. These direct air capture plant, what they want to see is they want to see large plants. They want to see a steady supply of energy, because it's an expensive plant. You can't just run it with a capacity factor of 20% with solar. And they want to see low cost, low temperature heat, which you can only get from nuclear or from geothermal in a sustainable way, not from solar, not from wind, and also not from hydro.
Okay. All right. That's great. Dude, this was so informative. Thank you for coming on. I
I
learned
hope
a
it
ton.
wasn't, I think it wasn't a bit too tedious and too boring.
I learned a ton. It's definitely what I'm looking forward to re-listening to. And so I hope everybody else is too. Guys, if you want to check Noah out or follow him, you can find all that stuff in the show notes. Noah, thanks again for coming on. And everybody remember, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. We will see you next time.